Good evening, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well today. Our time together is slowly coming to an end, and I'm really bummed. I miss you all. I miss having class. I miss chatting with you all face to face, and I just feel really bad that we weren't able to say a proper goodbye. I feel very, very bad about that. But we got to continue on with what we're doing. And today we are going to go over Holocaust literature, Holocaust in the United States. Okay, so before we get started, I'm going to look at the calendar to see what you all have to do. Last week you did not have a reader response because I figured you all needed a break. You know what? No reader response for this week either. So just do the two discussions. You guys are emailing me telling me that you're really having a hard time with some of your classes. So X out the reader response for this week. Just do your two discussions, okay? Next week, for May the 5th, you were to read the racial experiences of children. So you'll read part of Sherman Alexie's Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian and American-Born Chinese. Both readings are found on Blackboard. They're in the same folder that you found moused for today. Okay, so that's what we'll be reading for next time. Again, no reader response this week. You're welcome. Before we get started, the book that I'm going to recommend for you all, I know Michael Clary. Okay, he used to live here. He lives in California now. And he's a fantastic man, a fantastic writer as well. He wrote this while he was living here in El Paso with his wife. And I am not just talking about this book because he's my friend. It's actually pretty well written. It takes the idea that zombies have overtaken El Paso. If you read it and you are native to El Paso or you have lived here quite a bit, you'll be able to detect different places, like something cool happens in Symbol, or they'll be driving down Mesa and there's bodies everywhere. Anyway, it's really cool. I really enjoyed it. It's very fun, and he's actually written tons of more books, one of which I'm reading right now. I might start reading it. So yeah, his books are great. They are, I believe, available at Barnes & Noble. Okay, and I'm really sort of kind of pushing this book is because he is a local writer, and it's very, very difficult to break through as writers, and Mike has done it. And yeah, so take this book. This is the first one in a series. As you familiarize yourself more with his books, you'll notice that there are other series. I know he has one about King Arthur, and then he is coming with the one that I'm reading that I can't talk about because I don't know if he's made an announcement about it, okay? But definitely give this a shot. It's really fun to read. It's a fast read. And yeah, so anyway, read it. I think you'd like it. Okay, so for today, you were to have read Charles Reznikov's Children, which is a poem, Cynthia Ozik's The Shawl, and a few pages of Art Spiegelman's Mouse. It wasn't until I started downloading the pages for Mouse and kind of like flagging them in my book that I realized how many there were. And that's okay, because Mouse is worth the time and the effort to read it, okay? I hope that you all not only enjoyed the literature that we read for today, which is of course very somber. Perhaps enjoy is the wrong word. I hope that you all found it enlightening and learned a little bit from it. If I could, I would teach an entire class on Holocaust literature. I took Holocaust history and Holocaust history as an undergrad, Holocaust literature as a graduate student. So I read quite a bit of them. So we're going to go over the poem first, and then the story, and then Mouse at the end. This lecture is going to be a little longer than most because Mouse might take us a little longer. What I'm going to go ahead and do with Mouse is Joe, who's in the back, and I really discussed on what to do concerning the actual the printouts of Mouse. I thought about maybe putting a projector. It wasn't working on my walls, and I just want to make this as easy as possible. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to have you all sort of keep the lecture in the background, and then I'll tell you, okay guys, we're going to be Mouse Part 1, download it, and then you can just look at it. Much easier for me, I think, and it beats me having to point and maybe get you all confused with the presentation, okay? So let's go ahead and get started with the poem by Charles Reznikov, Children, which is in volume D, the yellow, volume D of your book on page 2524. Alright, so this is part of a larger work. Okay, but we're only going to read this one for today. Okay. Once among the transports was one with children, 2 freight cars full. The young men sorting out the belongings of those that had taken to the gas chamber had to undress the children, they were orphans, and then take them to the lazarette. There the SS men shot them. A large 8-wheeled car arrived at the hospital where there were children. In 2 trailers, open trucks, were sick women and men lying on the floor. The Germans threw the children into the trucks from the 2nd floor and the balconies. Children from 1-year-old to 10 threw them upon the sick of the trucks. Some of the children tried to hold on to the walls, scratch the walls with their nails, but the shouting Germans beat and pushed the children towards the windows. The children arrived at the camp in buses, guarded by the gendarmes of the French Vichy Government. The buses stopped in the middle of the courtyard, and the children were quickly taken off to make room for the buses following. Frightened but quiet, the children came down in groups of 50 or 60 to 80. The younger children were holding on to the older ones. They were taken upstairs to empty halls without any furniture and only dirty straw bags on the floor full of bugs. Children as young as 2, 3, or 4 years of age, all in torn clothes and dirty, for they had already spent 2 or 3 weeks in other camps uncared for, and were now on their way to a death camp in Poland. Some only had 1 shoe, many had diarrhea, but they were not allowed in the courtyard where the water closets were, and although there were chamber pots in the corridor of each story, these were too large for the small children. The women in the camp who were also deportees and about to be taken to other camps were in tears. They would get up before sunrise and go to the halls where the children were, in each 100 to 120 to mend the children's clothing. But the women had no soap to clean the children, no clean underwear to give them, and only cold water with which to wash them. When the soup came for the children, there were no spoons, and it would be served in tins, but the tins were sometimes too hot for the children to hold. After 9 at night, no one, except for 3 or 4 who had a permit, was allowed to stay with the children. Each of the rooms was then in darkness, except for 1 bulb painted blue by blacked out instructions. The children would wake at night, calling for their mothers, and would then wake each other, and sometimes all in the room would start crying out, and even wake the children in the other rooms. A visitor once stopped one of the children, a boy of 7 or 8, handsome, alert, and gay. He had only 1 shoe, and the other foot was bare, and his coat of good quality had no buttons. The visitor asked him for his name and then what his parents were doing, and he said, "Father is working in the office, and mother is playing the piano." Then he asked the visitor if he would be joining his parents soon. They always told the children they would be leaving soon to join their parents, and the visitor answered, "Certainly, in a day or 2. At that, the child took out of his pocket half an army biscuit he had been given in a camp, and said, "I am keeping this half for mother." And then the child, who had been so gay, burst into tears. Other children, also separated from their parents, arrived in buses, and were put down in the courtyard of the camp. A courtyard surrounded by barbed wires and guarded by the gendarmes. On the day of leaving for the death camp, they were awakened at 5 in the morning. Irritable, half asleep, most of them refused to get up and go down to the courtyard. Women, French volunteers, for they were still in France, urged the children gently to obey. They must and vacate the halls. But many still would not leave the straw bags on which they slept, and then the gendarmes entered and took the children in their arms, and the children screamed with fear, struggled, and tried to grasp each other. Women guards at the women's section of the concentration camp were putting little children into trucks to be taken away to the gas chambers, and the children were crying and screaming, "Mama, Mama," and even though the guards were trying to give them pieces of candy to quiet them. Okay, a couple of housekeepings. The gendarmes are a group of French policemen who are armed. Okay, that's what they are. That's what the gendarmes are. The Vichy government, for those of you who do not know, was established as, I guess, the puppet government in France after the Nazis' invasion. Okay, it's very convoluted what happened during this time, but to make it as simple as possible, once the Nazis took over France, and by the way, the French did fight back. Okay, there is an amazing line of resistance in France that went underground and eventually helped to defeat the Nazis. In France, the Nazis established a Vichy government, and it is to the shame of quite a bit of France's population that a large number of French officials and basically everyday people joined the government and would turn their own people into the Nazis to be taken away. Okay, it's something that's very painful in French history, and something that we really don't often know about. And I think that we should know more about the Vichy government, because you'll hear me say this a lot. Because the Holocaust did happen, we know it occurred, and Germany has paid. Okay, they have paid full dearly. They study the Holocaust. They know what they've done wrong, and yet in kind of country like France with the Vichy government, that sort of gets pushed under the table, and it's incredibly frustrating for me. Alright, another thing, let's see, a couple of things that I want to tell you about the Holocaust. Of course, this is talking about children. Here are a couple of numbers that I'm getting for you. The Holocaust began around 1933 with Adolf Hitler coming to power in Germany, and it ended in 1945 with the defeat of the Nazis. Okay, the number of people killed in the Holocaust stands at around 11 million, with 1.1 of them being children. Okay, that is a lot of children dead. 6 million of these victims were Jewish. The other groups that were targeted by Nazis were Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, disabled people, Roma. Some Catholics were thrown in there. Basically, the undesirables were taken away, but the vast majority were, of course, Jewish people. And the number that I do want you all to keep in mind is 1.1 million children. Okay. If you've ever watched the film Schindler's List, spoiler alert, okay, I'm going to spoil a pretty big portion of it. Schindler's List is filmed entirely in black and white, and it's a very stark film. I definitely recommend you watch it if you haven't. But there's a part in it where Oskar Schindler and his girlfriend stand up, like they're in a little hill with their horses, and they're looking down, and the people are being liquidated. We are going to talk about liquidation when we get to Mouse, but this ghetto is being liquidated, and people are just running, and it is just an absolute madhouse. And the attention of the camera and, of course, of the audience and Oskar Schindler is put on a little girl wearing a bright red dress. And if you can imagine, it's black and white. Red immediately draws your attention. It's this little girl, she's about 6 or 7, running across the courtyard, going and hiding under a bed. You see her hiding, okay, under a bed, and a bit further on, Schindler is standing in front of a group of bodies, and you see something red in there, obviously signifying the little girl. Okay, so that is a very powerful scene, and this is an incredibly powerful poem as well. I've had a lot of students tell me that this was very powerful. It was very uncomfortable to read, and if it does make us uncomfortable, it's supposed to make us uncomfortable, okay, because this happened. Okay, this isn't something that we will just go away. Okay, yes, the Holocaust supposedly ended in 1945, but I mean, arguably, the Holocaust is still going on for some people right now, and we'll talk about that when we get to Mouse. But let's start right here with this book. With this poem. Right at the beginning, we know that the transport with the children arrived. Okay, let's look at stanza number 2. The large 8-wheeled car arrived at the hospital where there were children. In the 2 trailers, open trucks, were sick men and women. Okay, so in these trucks, men and women on the floor, they're very ill. And what the Nazis are doing is they're getting the children and throwing them in the trucks from the 2nd story. Okay, so they're just throwing them in there. Okay, just sort of like you would do trash. And if you look at that, the Germans threw the children into the trucks from the 2nd floor to the balconies. The children from 1 year to 10 threw them upon the sick in the trucks. Some of the children try to hold on to the walls, scratched at the walls with their nails, but the shouting Germans beat and push the children toward the windows. This is purposeful evil, and this is incredibly cruel, because there are other ways to do this. Okay, these children did not have to be thrown up from the second floor balcony onto other bodies on the trucks. Okay, that didn't have to happen. Okay, it would have been probably much easier to just lead the children down. Okay, put them in there, but this is purposeful, this is cruel, this is very evil. And as some of you have told me, this is a very difficult poem to read, but look at the cruelty and the evil, and let's not turn away from it, okay, because this is exactly what the author wants us to do. We need to look at it, and we need to sort of bear witness to it. Let's look at the third very long portion. Okay, as we know, they arrive in Vichy-controlled France, and the gendarmes are there to keep order. Okay. Then the children arrived. They were taken upstairs to empty halls without any furniture and only dirty straw bags on the floor full of bugs. Okay, again, this is massive cruelty. This is war, yes, I understand, but these are also children we're talking about. And as I've mentioned before in my lectures, often as adults we think that we can put up with anything, right? But just as long as it doesn't affect the children, okay? If, like, when we were reading the landlord story, remember how Katie had enough money for shoes but forgot to buy her own shoes? Obviously we know that that's not what happened, that she probably needed the money for something else, or the shoes were much more expensive. We often want to keep children safe, and this is completely the opposite, right? And if we continue on, these children, as young as 2, 3, or 4 years, all in torn clothes and dirty, for they had spent 2 to 3 weeks in other camps uncared for. Okay, so these kids come in bearing this awful trauma of being taken away from their parents, being put in a camp. They probably don't speak the language, okay? It's probable that the Jewish children are coming from Eastern Europe, so they're going to France. Doesn't necessarily mean they speak French. Okay, so they're getting yelled at by these officers in French. The kids don't know what's going on. They want their parents. They are wearing dirty clothes. They haven't bathed. It's just cruel what they're doing to them. Okay, and even more right here, right? Some of them only had one shoe. They had diarrhea. It's unfathomable to me what happens here, right? They were not allowed into the courtyard where the water closets were, and although there were chamber pots in the corridor of each story, these were too large for the small children. Alright, so not only are they not allowed to have basic necessities and the basic hygiene, they are forced to relieve themselves in chamber pots, and chamber pots tend to be pretty large, and if it's a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old who has diarrhea, the kid probably isn't potty trained, and even if it's 4, 5, 6, or 7, they were not going to make it there. So what happens is you have the filth on the floor. We've talked about what happens when there is feces and urine and vomit and blood on the floor. Okay, that can cause major infection, trench foot, as you all were saying. But imagine, remember, these are children we're talking about. These are not adults, okay, and there's no one there to take care of them. Not their parents, anyway. Okay, you see that there are, though, some women who try to take care of them, and they do their best, right? So these women had no soap to clean the children, no clean underwear to give them, and only cold water. So these women were there, and they were trying to help as much as possible, right? And we know, going back to 2525, that these women were, the women who were trying to take care of them are deportees as well. Okay, so what would happen in the Holocaust is children are going to freak out, children are going to have anxiety. So what would happen is they would often be sent out with a group of women to take care of them and to say, don't worry, everything's going to be all right, okay, because children will look to helpers to let them know that everything's okay. Okay, they would try to do that, but of course these women here are completely out of their league. They don't have anything with which to take care of the children with, but they do their best. And if we go to the next page, 2526, what would happen to children? Okay, only a couple of them were allowed to stay with the children. The children would wake at night calling for their mothers, and then would wake each other, and sometimes in the room would start crying out, and even wake the children in the other rooms. Okay, so if you've got, what is the number? If you have maybe 50, 60 kids in a room. They're waking up, they're crying at 2 o'clock in the morning. They're waking up the other ones. No one is going to come to them to comfort them, to give them a glass of water. They're going to cry themselves to sleep. Okay, the trauma that these children are experiencing. Okay, right now I'm sure you all are reading it wondering why we have to read this. It's very traumatic for us to read this book. We can only imagine. It's unimaginable, right? The trauma that these kids are going through. And we get one example. If you look at line 70, this little boy, right, who's about 7 or 8, my kid who's over there right now playing video games, he's 8 years old. Little boy is 7 or 8, and he only has one shoe. Okay, but he has a coat and he has one shoe. And this visitor, okay, asks him, "Hey, what are your parents doing?" And he says what kids do, right? My dad's at work and my mom's at home. Okay, he asked the visitor if he would be joining his parents soon, and the visitor said, "Of course you will, in 2 or 3 days." Okay, that's a lie. Okay, and children are very perceptive. We may think that we can go ahead and lie to kids, but kids know when you're telling the truth. Okay, especially for strangers, they know when strangers are telling the truth. Okay, at that, this line always gets to me whenever I teach this. The visitor said, "Certainly in a day or 2 you're going to go see your parents." At that, the child took out from his pocket half an army biscuit that he had been given in camp and said, "I'm keeping this half for my mother." And then the child who had been so gay burst into tears. Okay, so at this point, why do you all think he started crying? Do you all think that he knew what happened to his mom? Do you all feel that he just, all of the trauma that he had experienced finally got to him? I'm actually curious to know what you all think about this. Okay, because like I said, we don't give children nearly enough. We don't give them the benefit of a doubt. We think that they're not very smart, but let me tell you, they're a lot smarter than we give them credit for. Let's go to the 4th stanza. Okay, we have other children, all separated from their parents, arrived in more buses. Okay, they went to the courtyard surrounded by the barbed wire, and the armed police were there. On the day of leaving for the death camp, they were awakened at 5 in the morning. If you all ever have to, you all waking up at 5 in the morning is hard. Waking up children that early is even more difficult, okay? They don't want to get up. Irritable, half asleep, most of them refuse to get up and go to the courtyard. Okay, I love that line because children are children everywhere, and I don't care if we're here or if we're in France or if we're in the Middle East, kids do not like to get up early. Okay, I love that line. I think that's a very touching line. Women, French volunteers, okay, for they were still in France, urged the children gently to obey. They must and vacate the halls. I mentioned the last time I taught this to pay attention to the French volunteers. Okay, that these women were French volunteers. And of course, me being the pessimist said, "Oh, they're part of the Vichy Government. They're probably just there, to try to have this like weird morbid sense." And a student, who is Richard's a very optimistic student. He said, "Well, maybe these volunteers actually volunteered to try to help these children." Okay, so let's give the volunteers the benefit of a doubt. They urged the children gently to obey. They must vacate the halls, but still they would not leave the straw bags on which they slept. Okay, and I told you they're sleeping in straw bags. They're not even given blankets, not even a pillow. They're sleeping in straw bags, and yet, even though they're in this horrible situation, they still don't want to leave their bags. Okay, they want to take the bags with them. And then the gendarmes entered and took up the children in their arms, and the children screamed with fear and struggled and tried to grasp one another. Okay, again, this is something that's very traumatic. Okay, taking a child from a place where they have been comfortable, and as much as I hate to say it, this room where they were being kept captive, they grew comfortable there because kids are very adaptable. That's even crueler now. Okay, now they're being taken. And if we look at the fifth stanza, and I want to ask what you all think about this. Women guards at the women's section of the concentration camps were putting little children into trucks to be taken away to the gas chambers. Alright, so we're back in the camp right here. Okay. And the women guards in the women's section have to put the kids in the trucks. Okay. And we often think, this is one thing that I hope that you get out of this class. We often think that, okay, good, evil, right? Black, white, alright. But I want you all to pay attention what the guards do to the children. Even though the children were screaming and crying, "Mama, Mama," even though the guards were trying to give them pieces of candy to quiet them. Okay, so we often think we have this idea, of the very cruel Nazi guard, right? Which of course was the truth more often than not. But these guards are trying to give these kids pieces of candy to quiet them. And every time I read this, I think that maybe that at this point, this is the line. Okay, a lot of us have different lines. I will not cross that line. Okay, I think that this is the one point where a lot of these guards, they just lost it. These are children. Okay, this isn't in their job description. Okay, once children are involved, the majority of people will sort of stand aghast, and these guards right here, some of them are feeling so traumatized themselves with having to take these kids to the gas chambers because these kids were going to die, that they're trying to give them candy. The kids know what's going to happen. Okay, kids are very perceptive, and that's how this ends. Okay, and I want you all to maybe discuss this right here, that children are children everywhere. Okay, what happens if a kid's crying at a doctor's office? What's the first thing they're going to do? They want to give them a candy. Okay, and that's what the guards are doing here, and I want you all maybe to discuss why. Why would the guards want to do this? Why not just throw them in there? Why not do what the Vichy government did? Isn't that weird? Okay, why not do what the Germans did in France, or what the Vichy government helped them to do in France? Okay, so I want you all to sort of bring that to the forefront and discuss that if you really want to. Okay, let's end this video here. We're going to go ahead and start the shawl, the next one, okay? So let's go ahead and stop now, and we'll continue with the shawl.